All right. Well, let's pray, and we'll get back into Exodus. Oh Lord, again, as we gather in Your name, we are grateful for a host of things. One, for this opportunity to study, to worship, to gather together. At the same time, we want it to be informative and instructive for our life. And so if You would grant us two things: one, grace, and then at the same time, a sense of courage and resolve that when our life and the text are not just similar but the same, that we would embrace it in such a way that it becomes a leveraging tool for You to use to bring about transformation inside of our life. In a group this size, we are mindful of all the different concerns and cares that we have that are part of this city, a part of this area, a part of the churches that are represented here, just who we are and what we carry in various forms. We want to be faithful to lift those up as well. For those that are joining via the internet, we give thanks for them. And so we pray not just for those that are in this room, but those who are watching wherever they may be. Guide us and direct us, O God, because what we do is give You this time and space and give You our lives, and we do it in the name of Christ. Amen. All righty, so we're in Exodus. I know that's a surprise, right? So, but Exodus chapter, somewhere in 7-8. Last week I was absent, and so John filled in, but so we have to go back another week to think about where we were at. And so all we did is just some general information about the plagues. I don't think we got into each individual plague. Is that correct? All right. And so what we want to do is let me just kind of give maybe just a brief recap, and then we'll actually go through the plagues themselves. What we discover is that the plagues follow a format, and there's some what we call parallelism that exists inside of the plagues. And what we discover is that, you know, the first two of each one seem to follow a format, and the last one of each is a little bit different. And so we also know that when plague number 4 is introduced, what we'll discover is that there then becomes a separation between Hebrews and the Egyptians, where from 4 on, at least 4 to 9, the plagues only deal with Egypt or the Egyptians. The first 3, or the first when it mentions Goshen, the area of Goshen, the first 3, it's universal in the fact that it hits both the Hebrews and the Egyptians. 4 on, there's a separation between, so it only hits the Egyptians. But then when we get to plague 10 in the Passover, it comes back and it's introduced back to both of them. And so there's just a little bit of structure that exists when we look at the text, maybe from the 1,000-meter view of what we discover about the plagues in general. What's interesting to me, and it's been something that I've sort of glossed over in previous years, but it has really stood out in the study of this year, is that there is a great deal of grace even in the plagues. And what I mean by that is there's limits, and which is interesting. That, plague 1 doesn't, plague 1, when plague 1 happens, it's not that it continually happens from here on out. And so when plague 2 is introduced, you have plague 1 and plague 2 operating at the same time. And then when plague 3 is introduced, you got 1 and 2 operating at the same time, and then 3 and on down the line. There's a start and a stop to each. And so in the Old Testament, often acts of grace, particularly around issues of judgment, is that the judgment is limited. which, I mean, if you think about that, that's an act of grace. And so we often, when we think about plagues, we just think about, when you think about plagues, what's the predominant thought? Is it not judgment? All right, and so, but, seldom do we also think about the fact that God limits all of this, which is an act of grace in my mind. And so, it's not just in my mind, but you can read commentaries on it and whatnot. But what you see is, God who is moving to a particular point, but at the same time, there's all type of grace for both parties, Egyptians and Hebrews, and which is to me fairly significant in the text. So those are just some preliminary issues that we find inside of this. What we also discover is that the plagues are of divine origin. The way the text describes them, they are not of human origin. That it's God alone who is acting. And the reason why I bring that up is keep in mind what the text has been moving us towards is a showdown between who has the most power, Pharaoh or God. And so this is the arena. This is the boxing match, for lack of better words. This is when they're about to have a showdown of who ultimately will illustrate their power or their power over the other. And when we get into the plagues, hopefully what we'll do today is that the Egyptian deities were often personified in ways of human bodies, animal heads. And so when we look at these are not just on a whim type items. Each one of these target a different structure inside of the Egyptian religious culture. And so when hopefully at the end of this lesson, you'll see that all the plagues are for a purpose to illustrate not just to Pharaoh, but to all that God is with ease overcoming the Egyptian religious world. All right, any comments or questions so far? Some of this, hopefully this is just somewhat of a recap from a couple of weeks ago. All right, well let's look at the plagues themselves. And so if we'll look at the first plague, if somebody could read chapter 7, 14 through 25. All right.
Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Stand by at the river bank to meet him. And take in your hand the staff that was turned into a snake. Say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you to say, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now you have not listened. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. See, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall be turned to blood. The fish in the river shall die, the river itself shall stink, and the Egyptians shall be unable to drink from water from the Nile. The Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over its rivers, its canals, its ponds, and all its pools of water, so that they may become blood, and that there shall be blood throughout the whole land of Egypt, even in the vessels of wood and the vessels of stone. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and of his officials, he lifted up his staff and struck the water in the river, and all the water in the river was turned to blood, and the fish in the river died. The river stank so that the Egyptians could not drink its water, and there was blood throughout the whole land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians had to dig along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water in the river. 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile.
All right. So what we have is the very first plague has to do with basically the life of the Egyptian world, which is the Nile. We know from history, just basic history, that the flooding of the Nile was vast, and when the Nile would flood, it made the ground very fertile, and so it was an economic powerhouse for the Egyptians, and what was considered the life of Egypt by all in that area becomes basically death. And so you got to see some of the play of what's going on. It would be, I'm not sure what, we don't have just one single commodity or industry that sums up the United States. Well, okay, water. Yeah, I mean that's a good. But it's even larger than that. It's not just water for life, but it's water for everything. And so what this becomes is just an initial. This would be the most important thing in the Egyptian life and culture and economy and to the fullness of the word. And the very first plague basically turns that on its head. And the spirit of the Nile inside of the Egyptian religious world, there was a god who in their mind lived in the Nile and was responsible for the flooding and all the things that went with that, and it was one of their gods for life and fertility and growth and things like that. And so right off the bat, Moses, or God via Moses, is illustrating that I have power over even that God, and so we see that in the first plague, that not just the economic structure, but the God. I think it's Hapi is the God's name, and so eventually, Moses, or God, is basically thumping that God and saying, "This is life. I'm going to show you that it's not." Does that make sense? Any comments or questions around the first? Well, I mean, there's it doesn't give us any understanding for how, other than the priest or the magicians. Right. Sure. They're same thing when Moses and Aaron come the first time, and they're just in Pharaoh's presence, and he throws down his staff, they throw down their staff. So they are. What we'll discover is that they are able to do the same thing for 1 and for 2, but when we get to 3, there's something that takes place in 3 that either the priest or the advisors or magicians aren't able to do. And they then disclose that Moses and Aaron are able to do this because of the finger of God. That's the phrase that shows up in the third plague. So see some of that progression, at least along, Betty, what you're talking about is they're able to copy, but when you get here, they're not able to copy. And then there, at least from their end, a declaration that this must be of God. But at least in some levels of religious life, but definitely in the economic life, you've got right off the bat God putting His finger on that, and it turns out bad for the Egyptians, and of course the Hebrews too. They're also would be affected by this. All right. Any comments about plague 1 or questions? All right. Let's go to plague 2. If somebody. Right. Well, in the question was, does plague 2 result because of plague 1? And I know for those that saw the movie God and Kings, that is the hypothesis of the director, is that these are natural occurrences, one leading to the other and on down the line, without really any interaction on behalf of God. I mean, that is a thought that people have towards this. That's not true to the text, because the text declares these are all at the hand of God. And so now keep in mind, the Bible is not, this goes back to one of our earlier lessons when we talk about just how do we approach the Bible. This is a book for insiders. It's not a book to prove the origin of the plagues. I mean, this is not where we would sit down and say, well, the Bible says it, so that's enough proof for all of, for infinity. It might be that, but that's not a question that the Bible is trying to answer. Okay? And so, right. Right. Well, that goes back to like Genesis 1. The way Genesis 1 approaches creation is that there was nothing, then all of a sudden there was something. And the one who caused the something to be was God. And but the Bible's not concerned with explaining to all of creation, how the plagues came to be. Well, the Bible says that God caused it. Well, okay. And but that's something that we bring to the text in the form of how we read the text, what we take from the text, because the Bible is written for people on the inside, not for people on the outside. Does that make sense?
What's the time period?
It doesn't tell us. It doesn't say like 2 days later plague number 2 comes. I think it's a good conclusion to draw that these were fairly quick. When one ends, Moses gets up, goes to Pharaoh. I mean, I don't, as I understand Exodus, even though it doesn't. So we're making some hypothetical thoughts in here, okay? But I think it's a pretty high probability that this is not something that was drawn over years. But when one ended, here comes another one. And because the idea is to, right. But what would work against that is, like say when we get to plague 2 and all the frogs come, well, they got to have time to put them in piles and get rid of them. And, not... Sure. I mean, but we don't know. I mean, that's the main thing.
The last verse of this, it says 7 days passed after the Lord struck.
Right.
So we know that at least that
Right.
time period was there.
But there are some ideas that give us some insight into thinking that it's not a long period like a decade, which is why I think you can realize that for the most part they're strung together. As if to say one plague happens, when that plague is over with, if it doesn't give us a description, whatever the normal amount of time would be to like if it says they got rid of the frogs, well, about what that would take. Okay, well, who knows? Maybe a couple of days, maybe a week or so. But then as soon as that's done, then came the next plague. And so, but we don't know. That's just not a question that it seeks to answer. So we just have to go with high probabilities, and but the key is that according to the text, what the text seeks to inform the reader, and it would be insiders who are reading this, is that this is at the hand of God, because this is a showdown between Pharaoh and God of who would be. Who's the strongest? Who's the most powerful? But it doesn't give tons of explanation for how God did it. Did he snap his fingers? Did he spit in the water? I mean, it just says Moses threw down his staff, or directed his staff, and there it happened. And so we just go with what it says. Does that make sense?
And nowadays,
Right, right, right,
Recently, they did have, red rain.
right. And so, and I think that was some of the origin behind the movie God and Kings, is that the director sought to explain those by natural or scientific issues without the concept of trying to explain it without, divine origin. And, which is okay. I mean, the scope of the scope of the director is not to usurp the Bible, it's to make money. And so, think about it. I mean, you might have a few people who make a film for some type of education or whatnot. They're called documentaries, and they do not make any money. Big pictures have, what's the real reason behind it? I mean, it's not to throw Exodus. It's the fact that faith films in some form or fashion over the last 10 years have become popular. All right? Mel Gibson's, what was the one he did? The Passion of the Christ. All right, that turned a corner on the fact that you can make $500 million by picking up a subject that used to be taboo, Christian religion. Well, what has happened since? Every year, there's a new movie that's come out. And there's some churches that have gotten into that business, and there's a little bit more descriptive in their purpose, but still at the same time, there is a goal behind the majority of films in Hollywood. It is not to be bankrupt. It is to make money, and they have discovered that Christians will spend to go to the movies. So the Exodus works out good. You put somebody like Christian Bale as Moses, very handsome guy. You give him, well, Charleston Heston's another one. Take your pick, okay? You get fairly handsome guy. You throw down some skills in fighting, which some good special effects. And when Charleston Heston when they did that film, that was about cutting edge for special effects back then. And you've got at least the couple of the digits in the equation that can do pretty good. And so, right. There's some levels that they have to stay somewhat true to the text. If not, then it's not the story of Exodus. But the goal of the director was not to spread Judaism or Christianity. It was, this is a good story. It's working well right now in culture. I can spin it a little bit, and we all win. That's sort of the idea behind it. So, Christians have a tendency. Now, this is we can go down this rabbit trail if you want, and that's fine. But if you don't want to, just shake your head no. It's been my experience that Christians look for, and this is not a bad thing, okay? We look for gospel in the world, okay? And we equate gospel in the world to be something better than something without gospel in the world. For instance, how many of you have said to other folks, well, I go to said doctor, he's a Christian? What's that got to do with whether or not he's a good doctor or not? Or does it? Okay, I'm not trying to skew you either way. But, is it ethics? Okay, that's fine. But, someone could have great ethics and be a sorry MD. Okay? So, and I'm not trying to, I am trying to push you on something. I'm not trying to steer you either way. But, we have a tendency to associate in any discipline faith as important as whatever the discipline is. That's not a bad thing, okay? I'm not trying to say we're wrong for doing that. But it's interesting to me that in the judging, and I don't mean judging as in 10 plagues, but in the assessing of somebody's effectiveness in another field, whether or not faith is a component of it. And it might be. Who knows? I'm not, I'm not trying to answer. But there, somebody could be good in baseball, and we say, "Oh, he's a great baseball player, and he's a Christian." Okay. I mean, does that make him hit the ball better? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, faith can be. Go back and read the bio of Eric Liddell. The song with the piano on the beat, "Chariots of Fire." Thank you. And he was very effective. Well, and from the movie and his own writings, what was the push behind his running was his faith. He felt in running it was obedience and brought God pleasure. So he ran naturally, as compared to someone else who they all worked and were tried to be disciplined in practice, but there was something about him that he just ran, with innocence, for lack of better words. But it's always interesting to me that this is just an observation that I have, that whatever it may be, we will the fact that we add faith to their effectiveness and whatever discipline, as if that's on the same par as whatever they're trying to do. Does that make sense? They can be a good teacher. Oh yeah, and they're a Christian. Okay, that's good. I mean, maybe there's some general issues that go with faith and ethics and how they treat people and things of that nature. That's great. I mean, I've known good Christian doctors that were terrible with bedside manner, and I've known non-Christian doctors who were great with bedside manner, and both of them be very effective. So, a little tongue-in-cheek, I always like to ask people, well, what does that mean when you say they're a Christian doctor? Does that mean they pray before they operate? Yeah, I hope so, at least with me. Did that help them get through med school? Did it not help them? Just what do we mean by that is where I'm going. So, could be, and and that's why I'm not trying to steer us in any direction. But it's interesting that in our conversation, and we do it even like with movies or other things that we say, oh, this is a great movie, and by the way, it has there are Christian actors in it. Okay, I mean does that mean that people who are not Christian who act are that they're not going to be good actors? What does being a Christian have to be with their effectiveness in their discipline? That's the question to ask and just consider, because it might have everything to do with it, okay, or it might have nothing. That's anyway. I'm not trying to. That's just observations I've made in 20 years of being a minister. What do we mean by that? Or what do you mean by that? Or what do I mean by that? Or does it mean anything? And it might not be. Okay, so let's just, y'all mind going down the rabbit trail or not? Y'all tell me what you want. Oh, you don't want to? Okay, we won't.
So she's saying you'd be more relaxed with your
Sure. So that becomes one of the major considerations for your cardiologist, right? Okay, or your whatever. So I mean, is that do you have that in the interview process? Well, not necessarily. I mean, I'm just, listen, I'm not trying to do anything other than stir the water, okay? And, but we ask this. It's not a bad question, because faith gives worldview, okay? Your faith in some form or fashion determines how you see other people, determines how you see the world, all right? So there's nothing wrong with it. But I would, what I would want is, why do we ask that? Or why do we say that? Is that because that makes us feel better? Okay. Or is it something to do with, is it a statement of how we live our life? And I mean, is it a statement of evangelism? Don't know. But it's just interesting that we do that.
I think these are people we need to trust, and it helps our trust.
Sure, okay. Well, that's why I said there could be some things on the outside. I mean, I'll take any praying doctor if they're operating on me, or if I'm the subject, I want some divine intervention, okay? And which is why when y'all, we pray for you, or not whoever. Anybody that's going into doctors or surgeries or whatnot. Part of that's our worldview. We believe that God interacts in time and space. But there are plenty of doctors that we see, some believers, some aren't. And so is faith the only consideration? Or is it a secondary, third? It's just, okay, and that's fine. I can live with that. I'm just, it's just interesting that becomes part of the way we describe someone's effectiveness in their professions. And sure, yeah. Pardon the pun, right? A shortcut, So again, I'll take, I'll take any and everybody praying for me if I'm the subject. So I have no problems with someone being, I hope that they're qualified and a good doctor just on every measure, but I have no problems with faith being a part of it as well. So, all right, sorry to take up your time. And so anyways, you can put that one on me. So let's go to the second one, second plague, 8:1 through 8:15, if somebody would read that one. All right.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Lord, let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs. The rivers shall swarm with frogs. They shall come up into your palace, into your bedchamber, and your bed, and into the houses of your officials and of your people, and into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all your officials." And the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, the canals, and pools, and make frogs come up to the land of Egypt, up on the land of Egypt." So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same by their secret art, and brought frogs up on the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, "Pray to the Lord to take away the frogs from me and my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." Moses said to Pharaoh, "Kindly tell me when I am to pray for you and for your officials and for your people, that the frogs may be removed from you and your houses, and be left only in the Nile." And he said, "Tomorrow." Moses said, "As you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs shall leave you and your houses and your officials and your people. They shall be left only in the Nile." Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried out to the Lord concerning the frogs that he had brought upon Pharaoh. And the Lord did as Moses requested. The frogs died in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said.
Okay, thank you. Do we see, I just want to raise up some items in the text that are noteworthy. Do we see any progression in Pharaoh between how he reacted in Plague 1 to how he reacts in Plague 2? All right, tell me what it is. Right, he didn't do anything in the first one, did he? So you see, at least now when you've got the frogs here, that there's some progression in Pharaoh. Whether it's short-lived or not, we don't know yet. We're only in second plague. And but upon what happened, Pharaoh does go to Moses and say, "Pray to your God that that there'll be a limit here," which is interesting. And now, something you need to know, you might already know this. Again, Egyptian deities, human body, animal face. Obviously, there was a deity that had the face of a frog. It was the goddess of fertility, which would be the goddess of life and birth and things of that nature. And so now, get a picture of what's going on. the goddess whose face is a frog, the goddess of fertility, whose face is a frog, and now is the source of decay and death. So I mean, think about it. And so if you're just average Joe or average Jane Egyptian, and you look out there, and this would have been common knowledge for the average person, that the goddess of fertility, whose face is a frog, now you see a bunch of frogs that should be the symbol of fertility, now become the symbol of death or the symbol of decay, and which is fairly significant. So we've got the. Did you have a? Oh, that's all right. No.
Did I hear you say that once they did the frogs, the blood was still in the water?
No. What I was saying is that it's not that. That what we have, and this is an act of grace, that each plague there's a limit, which means it has a start time and a stop time. That it's not a continual basis of, once plague 1 is operative and the Nile turns to blood, it's going to be blood from here until here. It actually stops. Well, when it stops, then comes plague 2. Plague 2 has a start and a stop. And so plague 3 does not begin until plague 2 ends. Now, I would argue that that is an act of grace by God. And so also it is to prove a point. I've asked for them to turn the air down, so it's a little warm. This time of year, it starts cold, and and then it gets hot within 2 hours. So if you see Tim come in with his little gun, if he does, erupt with clapping. Okay, so just so he won't know it, so we'll just pretend. All right. So but what we have is a start time and a stop time of each one, and so when the frogs end, then at some point we'll be ready for plague number 3. But what you have is in this progression of God, origin of it here at God's hand, the limit of it here at God's hand. For what purpose? Well, what would be great would be to lead everybody to an understanding that God is overall. But what we find in Pharaoh, that's not his decree. We get bits and pieces of it, but the starting and the stopping are both seen as acts of God. One is incredibly gracious because it has a limit, but it's for the purpose. And we see a little bit this here in plague number 2, when you have Pharaoh, first plague, he just goes into his palace. It actually says what he retreats into his heart or something like that. Verse 22 in chapter 7, the magicians did the same thing. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house. He did not even take this to heart. So you've got that in the first plague. Second plague, there is some level inside of Pharaoh that sees what's happening, goes to Moses and says, pray that this will stop. So there's at least something that has taken place. Now we'll discover, and I'll give you a little foreshadowing of this, there'll be there'll be times where he does that back and forth. But we know the end of the story, and so we know that in the end, his heart does not change completely. And so there is at least something in Pharaoh where I see it is of God, pray to God to stop it. It does stop, and as soon as it stops, he goes back to old ways. Now, I would argue that's fairly typical of humanity in general. Think about what happens when there's been the assertion of pain inside of your own life for whatever reasons, okay? I'm not saying it's of God or not. I'm just saying that imagine what takes place whenever there's pain in your life. What we want more than anything else is for pain to stop. And so when pain stops, do we still continue the same the same level or the same aspect when whatever is causing the anxiety has been relieved? Most people do not. Okay, well, that's all right. Say it louder. I can't hear you. Okay, yeah. There could be, Pharaoh. He's got his Pharaoh hat on, and he's got to lead the people, and he knows what's going on, and maybe he's playing both sides in order to, Okay. I'm, I but it might not be, because in a minute when we get through I do want us to spend some time. We need to take a break in a second. I do want to spend some time on Pharaoh's heart today, if we can get to it. Because in these plagues, what you'll also notice is that Pharaoh hardens his heart, God hardens his heart, or it says his heart was hardened. And all three of those are used interchangeably. Now, which one is it? Is it God that does it? Is it Pharaoh that does it? Or does it just happen by itself? And so I do want us to spend a little bit of time on that if we get to it. So let's do one more plague, and then we'll take a break. All right, any comments about 1 or 2? All right, 1 start, 1 stop, 2 start, 2 stop. Now we're in plague 3. So if somebody would read plague 3. The reading is not as bad now, so if somebody was counting words, we're going pretty quick now.
What verse is
16, yeah, I'm sorry, 8:16 through 8:19.
Then the Lord said to Moses, Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground. And throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats. They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff, and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came from man and animal. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. And the gnats were on men and animals. The magician said to Pharaoh, This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said.
All right, thank you. So here we have the introduction of the finger of God, and so that's, and we have some acknowledgement, at least from the priest or the magicians, that they cannot do this. That there's now a difference between what Moses is doing and what they were able to do. So we see a little bit of progression inside of that group with the gnats or the lice. I think maybe some of your Bibles might say lice or dust. Dust, yeah. There was a god named G-E-D. G-E-B. Excuse me. What did I put? D. B was the god's name, and he was the god of the land. And he also had a whole sect of priests that were set aside to this god. Some of the gods and goddesses had a full section of priests and that were assigned to the gods. Some of them weren't. Some of them were lesser. But the major gods in the Egyptian deity world had their own set of priests, and this is one of them. Yeah, our word would be idols, okay?
The way you said that last time, it made it sound like he was a man that had his own set of priests.
Well, human body, deity, they would have a chief priest. Probably a good comparison that we're maybe more familiar with is the Egyptian pantheon. Where you have the Greek gods, and they were gods of certain things, and they would have their own temples, and they would have their own personifications of that. And there's a group of priests or people that would be set aside to take care of that temple in that religious structure. Obviously, there would be one, maybe the chief priest of the god Zeus. Well, here in the Egyptian world, you have a god of the land, and this god had its own set of priests inside of their religious structure, and they were very powerful inside of the Egyptian culture. And so with all that taking place, okay, you've got the god of land who's supposed to control this. One of the things that this god in the Egyptian mind was supposed to do was to make sure that there wouldn't be pestilences like gnats or lice or whatnot that would hurt the people. And so people would go and they would pray and sacrifice to that god. The magicians nor the priest of this god were able to duplicate what Moses is able to do. So see on a larger picture what's going on. You've got the God, a very powerful God in their religious structure, whose role is to make sure stuff like this doesn't happen. All right? I mean, and yet Moses, just by his actions, all of a sudden now that God is set on its head. Does that make sense? So you see some of the stuff that's going on. See the big picture. One by one, God is picking off the power structures inside their religious thought. No, these are there's a reason why, what I would argue is there's a reason why it is a frog. There's a reason why it is dust. There's a reason why it is the Nile. There's a reason why it is flies. There's a reason why it is livestock. These are on purpose. They're not just haphazard. God's got some dice and He throws it and says, "Oh, it's a fly. Well, we're going to do fly now." I mean, this is very specific because it's not just, it's Pharaoh and the entire structure that Pharaoh lives in, operates in, that is being turned on its head.
So God is saying these God of
Right, it's exactly right. Or the God whose face is fertility, birth, life, decay, death. So I mean, you see, put a good kind of a way to kind of get your head around this is imagine you are an everyday person in the Egyptian world and you open up your kitchen window and you look out and see frogs and they're dying. Well, you go to your religious calendar and you say, "Gosh, it's the month of March. That's the fertility." I'm making this part up, okay? But it's like we have these calendars, saints and things like that. It's the month of March, and I know that the fertility god has a face of a frog, and I look out my window and I see dead frogs. That's not supposed to happen. This is the face of the God of life, and now it's the symbol of death. Here's another one. This is supposed to be the God that makes sure we don't have things like this happen. Well, guess what? New sheriff in town, all right? And his name, his poster boy is Moses, and he's got a little sidekick named Aaron, and he's bringing in a new message. So see the larger picture of what's going on. Now inside of that, we also want to look at the 1 meter view, and we see some things that are going on that are different from one plague to the next. We've got in plague 1, no indication of anybody that this makes a huge splash. Second plague, at least Pharaoh, there's some indication that Pharaoh sees something. Third plague, the magicians and you could argue the priests of this god are not able to do it. And so from their mind and their voice, there's an acknowledgement that, well, we don't really know what it is, but it's definitely at the finger of their God. So you see a little bit of change that's going on. All right? Any comments, questions? We need to take a break. I know that. Take about 10 minutes. All right? I've discovered in ringing the bell, you have to be committed. If you're committed, it rings. If you're not, it's kind of, I don't know. So, yeah, I need a bong. I got a gavel. I could bring that in here. This feels better now.
Okay, it's coming down.
Well, but it's with the heat, you start in the morning at 50, and by 11 o'clock it's 75. There's no way you can adjust this.
We were in alarm status.
Which means it's getting ready to fire.
No, which means it was not going to. You were actually getting
Just
cool
recirculate.
water running through here.
Yeah.
The problem was the chiller wasn't cooling the water.
I got you. I got you.
So that's where you have to look, and you just, I don't know why.
All right, guys, we'll go ahead and begin. Hopefully you have a copy of the prayer list, and hope that you'll take that with you and use it in the form of prayer, devotion, things of that nature. I know the people that are on it will be grateful. Sure. And all right, any comments or questions before we start back up? All right. Well, we're now on the fourth plague. So if somebody would read for us chapter 8:20 through 8:31. And what we want to do is a couple things. We want to pay attention on the 1,000-meter view. But if there's something that we see in Pharaoh, something that we see in the difference between the first three plagues, in the reading and the listening, let's look and see also on the 1-meter view if there's something that we can notice about the fourth plague that is significant to only the fourth plague. So would someone be so gracious, 20 through 32? All right.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the water, and say to him, 'This is what the Lord said. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on your officials, on your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies, and even the ground where they are. But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This miraculous sign will occur tomorrow.' And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the house of his officials, and throughout Egypt the land was burned by flies. Then Moses summoned Moses and Aaron. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, 'Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land.' But Moses said, 'That would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God as he commands us.' Pharaoh said, 'I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the desert, but you must not go very far. Now, pray for me.' Moses answered, 'As soon as I leave you, I will pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people.
All right. Thank you, Sal. So what do we see about this area or this plague that might be a little different than the other plagues? Or did we see anything? Sure. So we have the separation, and the word there is, there's a specific Hebrew word that means to make, to distinguish, to make separate. So there's definitely where it's only hitting the Egyptians now, it's not affecting the Hebrews in that area of Goshen. Anything else that shows up? Yeah, and so now you see a little bit more of progression. Gene's point still is well made. He prays, but soon as the threat is gone, well, I was just kidding. And so I take it back, so. Right. One of the things that's interesting according to the wording that doesn't show up, maybe some of your Bibles and paraphrases might do a better job than some of the others. But there's words that are used to describe that in Pharaoh's house, it was more dense with the flies, which means it was like not twice, I don't know the number, but it was more flies in Pharaoh's house than in the normal land. And so, with the wording, it illustrates that there are flies everywhere, but in Pharaoh's house, boy, they were really bad. And the word that is used there to describe how dense it was is the same word that is often used to describe heavy or to describe hardening. And so the word that is used to describe the amount of flies in Pharaoh's palace is the same word that is used to describe Pharaoh's heart. There could be nothing in the text. I mean, I'm not the Hebrew scholar. Maybe John might want to weigh in a little bit more than me. But at least in the wording, it's interesting. But it's very dense in Pharaoh's palace, more dense than outside, just in the normal area, and then nothing going on in Goshen. Now, what we do know about the God, there was a certain God whose role was to the dog fly in Egypt was one of the main sources of blindness. The larvae would lay eggs in anything that was living, and so often it would lay eggs in someone's face, and it would, the larvae would eat, the flesh, and it was one of the major causes of blindness. And this role of this God, Uatchit, was to keep that in check. And so, think about again what God is doing with the religious structure. A God whose job, just like the God of land, who's supposed to keep in check lice, dust, things like that. The God who's supposed to keep in check, flies that can cause diseases, all of a sudden is not able to perform His job. And the reason He can't, because the hand of God is limiting. So just again, interesting. Average Egyptian person pulls up the month of April, sees the God that's in charge of keeping the flies in check, look out and sees flies out in the culture and in the society. Well, what are the thoughts being drawn then? So you see what God is doing. All right. Anything else that we see in the fourth plague that we think is noteworthy? We got it. What's it say about? Right. Right, which is interesting, because earlier and that's a good point. Earlier in the book, the story of Exodus, the book, what we have is one time we're going to go completely, another time we're going to go 3 days and worship and then come back, and it's a little hard to determine if which if they're synonyms and they really mean the same thing. Or if one is a request, but we know that's going to be turned down, and so then we're going to do what we're really going to do. But this is the first time that has come up. We also see that Pharaoh hardens his heart. It's not God that hardens it. It's not his heart's not hardened. We don't know yet we haven't spent any time on that, but but we do know in the Exodus text that there are times Pharaoh hardens, times God hardens, times where it just says the heart was hardened. And so we might get into it this week, if not for sure next week. Well, not next week, and not the week after that. So maybe in April we'll get to it. I better, all right. We talked about on Wednesday night supper a couple of Wednesdays ago, learning to wait, to develop patience. And what I should have referenced was this class, because we never get to the end. And so, maybe that's the lesson. I'm going to have to go back and watch this one and learn something about that. All right, so anything else about the fourth plague before we move on to the fifth plague? All right, let's get it. We're into chapter 9 now. And so if someone would read chapter 9, verse 1 through 9, verse 7.
I'll read it, but
All right?
hear how far. 7 to go. 7.
Yeah, just verse 7. Read the start of the beginning of chapter 9 through verse 7.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses and donkeys and camels, and on your cattle and sheep and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die." The Lord set a time and said, "Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land." And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh sent men to investigate and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites has died. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go.
All right. So what do we see about the fifth plague that might be insightful when compared to the other plagues? Right, still have the distinction, that's right. So we know that at least in plague 4 and plague 5, there's a distinction between the two.
Pharaoh was aware of the distinction because he said one
Right.
out, and it still didn't do any good.
That's right. So there's obviously something where he learned from the fourth plague that the distinction was that it's ongoing now. Anything else? What do we know about Pharaoh's heart? All right, who hardened his heart here? Yeah, it doesn't say. It just says his heart was hardened. Does anybody have anything else in your versions? It remained hardened. Okay. It remained stubborn. All right. Again, that word there is dense or heavy, and it's the same word that's used there.
They were slaves, he could just take theirs.
Well, he could. Yeah. I mean, we don't know if he did that. I mean, obviously, I guess he didn't because it doesn't show up in the text.
I didn't hear it say, and maybe I missed it, I was looking at that Aaron had to raise his staff or whatever. No staff raising.
Yeah, no. Some have. It's interesting. Some of the plagues, Moses is the one that raises the staff. Some of the plagues, it's Aaron. Some of the plagues, it's not anything. And I'm not sure. I haven't found anything to describe the significance behind that. And so, my take then is that these are just synonymous among themselves. It's, Shane spoke, the preacher spoke, or, the person who speaks on Sunday was speaking. Something like that. I mean, it's just all used in some level as meaning the same thing. But if you come across something somewhere, that might be a good dissertation project. So if you still fancy yourself in the line of education, who knows? We could see what goes. The god that had the head of a cow was considered a mother goddess and was very prominent in the religious society. And even though it mentions other animals than cows, but obviously this would be some level of a a shot across the bow of one of their major goddesses who had a face of a cow, and her role was also, a goddess of life. And so it's interesting that, again, as we're tracking the progression of the plagues, that they're not just haphazard items, that that God is targeting the major religious structure, the major power inside of the Egyptian world, and this would be another one. All right? Yeah, but that is something that we have for the first time, where in verse 5 it says, where Moses goes, confronts Pharaoh, says, this is what we're going to do, and then the text highlights the timing. And so, that does give us, at least, even though we don't know exactly how long it took, we do have in some of the plagues, we had in the first one, good catch here, we have in the second one, where at least there's some introduction of a time element, a day, tomorrow, things of that nature. Sure. It's interesting where, and that could be, that's a good point. There could be some, it'd be worth exploring. Is this a redemptive measure? To say, look, I want you to pay attention to this. If you don't do this, this is going to happen. It's going to happen tomorrow. You can save it. Don't let it happen. Let us go. All right? Well, yeah, with the flies, we don't have that type of time element here. Yeah, he tells them it's going to come. Right. Sure. Right. So I think it's worth exploring. There could be some. Again, now we're reading in a little bit to the text, okay, because the text is not giving us all the information to make it exact. But I think we can make a case that there are some, there's either a redemptive measure here, or there is an exact measure that says, I'm about to do this, so that you know that it's beyond question, this is what's going to happen. So, both of those, I think there's some evidence in the text to give us some understanding here.
It seems like they start from the beginning, it starts like that.
Right.
They get rid of them pretty quick, and this, they get a little time, then they do this, and then they find out they can get rid of that, and slowly they're finding out they
Sure. Well, and that's an interesting thought, because when we get to the 10th plague of Passover, it is Pharaoh. This is on you now. And so, it's not about anything else. And the language, and also we'll discover when we get to Passover, the descriptions that are used with the 10th plague far outweigh all the other plagues. You've got 2 complete chapters set aside for number 10. And it's the first plague that comes with exact prescriptions to follow. You are to do this. You are to do it this way. You are to do it on this day. And then after you've done these things, then you do this. You do it this way at this time for this purpose. And so the 10th plague is a little bit different. And it's very descriptive. And it becomes, this is where it's all in, to use that language. This is the final showdown when we get to the 10th plague. And you've got Pharaoh where it's on him. It's no longer just general. It's very specific. This is on you, big guy. And of course, it's a much harder punishment, because it also strikes at the very heart of Pharaoh, his descendants, the next in line for power. All right. So it's a good comment. All right. Anything else about number 5? All right. Let's look at number 6. If somebody would read chapter 9, verse 8 to verse 12. So 9:8 through 9:12. All right.
Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Take such
toss it into the sky while Pharaoh watches. It will spread like fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, causing balls to break out on people and animals alike. So they gathered the soot from the furnace and went to see Pharaoh. As Pharaoh watched, Moses tossed the soot into the air, and terrible balls broke out on the people and the animals throughout Egypt. Even the magicians were unable to stand before Moses because the balls had broken out on them too. But the Lord made Pharaoh even more stubborn, and he refused to listen, just as the Lord had predicted.
Well, thank you. We also have here now where it says the Lord is doing some things to Pharaoh's heart, which, in the last 3 plagues, we have Pharaoh did it, it happened, and then we got God doing it. So, there's some, is that distinctive or is it something else? We don't know yet. We haven't looked at it. And, but we've also got this influencing, again, there's a separation between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, so we're still tracking that line. You've got dust, there was a goddess who was in charge of healing, or that was her, her main reason inside of that religious structure. She was similar to, she had her own set of priests, so she was very high in the deity world of the Egyptian religious structure, and often her priests would be called when people became sick, and their job was some level of healing inside of that religious structure. And so you've got a god whose job or a goddess job of healing is not able to heal because of what God has done. Anything else do we see in the 6th plague that's noteworthy?
It didn't say, the Lord said, let my people
Right. Yeah. So we just have God, Moses. Hey, you just go do it. That's straight to the quick. Yeah. It's and now that could be significant. That might just be just a general omission. We don't know. Again, that's something that the text doesn't tell us. But we could see it just in line that this is just a continuation of what's going on, or it could be something very significant. Right? Yeah, we don't. Yeah, there's no what I would call introductory statements. It's just God to Moses, go do this, and boom, here it comes. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I think in 4 through 10 that yes, he is attacking the Egyptians more and all, but by doing that, I think he's beginning to show these Israelites they are the chosen people.
Well, we hadn't even thought about that. Okay. Well, which is interesting because when we get to plague 10, this is the only time that there are demands made of the Israelites, and it's
Carry that over to the festival.
right. Well, don't go so far yet. We're still on 10. We're still on whatever. But what you've picked up is very significant. There's nothing required of the Israelites in all of this. Okay, when you get to plague 10, not only is there a requirement, it's a requirement with a bunch of strings. And it's very exact. And so when we're going to look at 10 just separate. 10 will be its own lesson because it's very significant. And but that is an interesting point. Is God from 4 on showing something to the Israelites? Okay, could be, because when we get to 10, that's not, again, we don't know because the text doesn't tell us, but if we can make a logical argument that there is something to that, because as the plagues progress from 4 to 9, when they get to 10, they have to choose. Well, think about the progression of that. Do you just choose blindly? Most of the time, that's not how God works. If you go back and look at the greater scope of the Old Testament and then the greater scope of the Bible as a whole, God normally manifests something and then requires something after that. For instance, when we get out of Egypt and we go into when they leave through the Red Sea, all that, when we get past those passages, what you'll find is that the call for obedience is not first. The call for obedience doesn't come until what, chapter 20? Well, we got 19 other chapters of God acting, God caring, God being gracious, God providing, God redeeming, God liberating, long before there's a call for obedience, which is interesting. It is, isn't it? Well, it is, yeah, so, well, I mean, all right, okay, let's stay with this. This is a big theme that shows up in the Bible, and you definitely see it in the New Testament. Look at it as I just wrote the Easter bulletin cover, and so think about Easter for a second. Long before there is any acknowledgement from our end of resurrection, of faith, or anything, God has been active. And it's not dependent upon your recollection or your understanding or approval of it. Okay? God acts. That's part of His nature. For 19 chapters, God acts. Why? Because He decided to do it. What does it say at the end of chapter 2? I see, I hear, I remember, and now I'm going to do something about it. Okay? For 19 chapters, He's acting. And He's proven to the Hebrews, to the Israelites, He's proven to the Egyptian what the real deal is. All right? Now, in choosing, it's what the party does in the Passover. They choose to mark their house, okay? In choosing God, all right? They leave, they exit out of Egypt. Then comes obedience, not as you got to do it or I'm going to get you, okay? Obedience is just a natural living with a God whose nature is this way. That's the way obedience is described in Exodus. All right? So reference back to the sermon on Sunday. That's where a lot of that came from, even though we didn't use Exodus as the text. It is not you go and have to do something to prove or to merit or to get something from God. God acts because it's His nature. Living out of His... A good way of interpreting what that shows up in Exodus is God saying to the children of Israel, go be the people you're meant to be because you're connected to me and I am the God that I am. All right? That's another way of paraphrasing the idea of, if you love me, keep my commandments. They are for a while, and but you also have the rise of, over the next, 100 years or so, you've got some other major people. The Assyrians are starting to gain traction, and you've got some other people in this area. In Hezekiah's reign, if you go back to when we were looking at the kings, and which is some years down the road, okay? But you have Egypt, the waning empire, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians who have been active now for over 100 years. Okay, so it's not like they're the next, in a year they become a powerhouse. This stuff is going on for hundreds of years. But they are in full force, and Egypt is got the walker. They're on the way out. And but what happens is the Assyrians and the Babylonians defeat the Egyptians, and that's really it. And then we really don't hear it. That's it. Yeah, we don't really find anything else. That the fact that you have to leave the Bible to figure out what happens because the battle's not here. The fighting takes place down here. But you have other empires pretty much putting some. And then you've also got the Ethiopians down here. There's a rise there. Their kingdom becomes fairly large. And so Egypt is, after this, after about maybe, 70 to 100 years later, you got some inner turmoil inside the Egyptian issue. So they're not unified. and then you got the rise of some other powers, and they within about 100 years or so they're on their way out. Maybe they're still strong. Don't get me wrong, but they're nowhere near the level of strength that they were, at now or even just a tad before. That's a good question, though. All right. Any other comments about the where we're at? We're on plague hail. All right. Let's get to what number is that? That's number 7. All right. So let's read 7. That would be verse 9:13. This is a long one through verse 35. All right. 9:13 through 9:35. You get the long suffering award. So.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning, go to Pharaoh and tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go so they can worship me. If you don't, I will send a plague that will really speak to you and your officials and all the Egyptian people. I will prove to you that there is no other God like me in all the earth. I could have killed you all by now. I could have attacked you with a plague that would have wiped you from the face of the earth. But I have let you live for this reason, that you might see my power and that my fame might spread throughout the earth. But you are still lording it over my people, and you refuse to let them go. So tomorrow at this time I will send a hailstorm worse than any and all of Egypt's history. Quick, order your livestock and servants to come in from the field. Every person or animal left outside will die beneath the hail." Some of Pharaoh's officials believed that what the Lord said. They immediately brought their livestock and servants in from the field, but those who had no respect for the word of the Lord left the manna open. And the Lord said to Moses, "Lift up your hand toward the sky and cause a hail to fall throughout Egypt, on the people, the animals, and the crops." So Moses lifted his staff toward the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning struck the earth. The Lord sent a tremendous hailstorm against all the land of Egypt. Never in all of the history of Egypt had there been such a storm like that, with such severe hail and continuous lightning. It left all of Egypt in ruins. Everything left in the fields was destroyed, people, animals, and crops alike. Even all the trees were destroyed. The only spot in all Egypt without hail that day was the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel lived. Then Pharaoh urgently sent for Moses and Aaron. "I finally admit my fault," he confessed. "The Lord is right, and my people and I are wrong. Please beg the Lord to end this terrifying thunder and hail, and I will let you go at once." "All right," Moses replied. "As soon as I leave the city, I will lift my hands and pray to the Lord. Then the thunder and hail will stop. This will prove to you that the earth belongs to the Lord. But as for you and your officials, I know that you still do not fear the Lord your God as you should. The Lord God as you should. All the flax and barley were destroyed because the barley was ripe and the flax was in bloom. But the wheat and the spelt were not destroyed because they had not yet sprouted from the ground." So Moses left Pharaoh and went out of the city. As he lifted his hands to the Lord, all at once the thunder and hail stopped and the downpour ceased. When Pharaoh saw this, he and his officials sinned yet again by stubbornly refusing to do as they had promised. Pharaoh refused to let the people leave, just as the Lord had predicted.
All right. This narrative is the longest of all of them. Thank you, Joanne, for doing that. But at least in wording, this one is longer than the other ones, with the exception of the last one. The first 9 plagues are seen sort of as a whole unit. The 10th plague is seen as something different. And so when we're reading the text, sort of get your mind around that kind of concept. So of the 9, this narrative is the longest. What do we notice about this one that's different than the others? Got a warning, got a long warning, and a lot of description.
And the Lord, the God of the Hebrews said.
Yeah, that's not in every one. There's in a couple of them it says that, but it's not in every one where you got a description of who God is and God of what, or God of who. It's one other plague. I know at least in one other plague. I think it's in. Oh gosh, I just saw it. But there's one other plague where it says the God of the Hebrews. But it's not in all of them. So that's a good catch. Right, right. Well, yeah, in the eighth plague we see it. Yep. Um,
This one it said that some of the Egyptians believed.
right. Okay. Good. So you see some other things going on. That I don't know. I don't know if that's in the city or in the palace, or we don't know what that means. That would be something that would be. We just don't have a lot of information around it. But there's obviously going out. There are some others where he goes out. My mind would be out in public. So whether or not that's out of the city or out in the public. We don't know exactly where that is. But there is obviously, he doesn't do it in Pharaoh's presence. He does it in another place. But that's interesting. Because that is something that when we read, it's okay, why, is that something distinctive here? Or where it is very important? Or is it just something that is part of the text that we don't have an answer to? But that's a good question to ask.
Is it the first time that Pharaoh ever done anything?
Yeah, you have an omission here of something for the first time, and there's also another introduction. Stay in that area. What do you find for the first time here in this? Right. All right. We have got two people talking at one time. Hang on, just a second. That's right. Go ahead.
Moses told Pharaoh he knew that his heart was not right towards God.
Sure.
Is that the first
That's the first time that you have some level, and not just hardened, but not right towards God. So you have a clarification on some of that. Sally, what were you going to say?
I just said I thought it was one of the first times he was letting Pharaoh see Moses had some power on God.
Well, say more to that. So I know.
He said, stretch your hand out to the sky and you will cause.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So and that could just be clarification, right?
Feel better about himself and showing him he's got some power, and maybe he's showing Pharaoh that Moses has got some power.
I think definitely the latter, on the idea that Moses as the instrument, but all reverting back to God as the one who is orchestrating all of this. What else shows up in this passage? Yeah, there. Yes, ma'am.
It says, but I have raised you up in this very purpose,
Okay, so we got some.
to show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all.
Yeah, you get a lot of description from God on purpose. Why we're doing this? Why where God is disclosing to Pharaoh via Moses why God is doing this. So, and then, Linda, what did you say? I'm sorry.
That Pharaoh says that he has been wrong and that he is going to let.
Right, you do have an admission from Pharaoh, and at least the idea of, now y'all can leave. That's the first time that shows up. What does it say about Pharaoh and his people?
I love the one about the servant, that his servant obviously was overhearing the conversation and he went and hid his cattle. And they were
Yeah.
killed, and the ones out of the field first.
Right.
So some of the people were coming around and thinking, well, maybe this God is powerful. And so I love that.
Or his bank account's not as large as Pharaoh's. So I mean,
The cattle were all just killed and now it says livestock again.
yeah. So
How did that happen?
don't know. We don't have an answer to that. We don't.
We have to import some livestock.
Well, we don't know if the livestock here was throughout all the land or was in a certain area. But we don't know because now we got cattle back up here. We don't know if there's, if they went and bought some. I mean, it's just all hypothetical. We don't know. So that's just a question that the text does not answer. What does it say in verse 34 about?
Where God said, just as I told you, Pharaoh is not going. Pharaoh, real hard, still will not.
What does it say? Okay, whoa, hang on. What did you just say? Right. Has sin been introduced before here? And so we have sin now being connected to hardening of heart, right? Isn't that what that verse says? It says, but when Pharaoh saw that the rain and that the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned once more and hardened his heart. Now, that could be two separate items altogether, or in Hebrew language, it could be one given a description to the other. And so I would argue that sin and hardening of the heart are related. Now, that's the first time we have that here, and that's fairly significant. I'll have to go back and check it. I think this is the first time the word sin is used in Exodus.
Verse 27 of this version says, "This time I have sinned."
Right. Well, but what I mean is the first time in this plague that the concept sin is being introduced. And it's being introduced on Pharaoh's side, not on the Hebrew side. Because later on, when we get post-Ten Commandments, we get a different understanding of what sin is. Or we get an understanding that sin is connected to a way of life that is given or subscribed by God to Hebrews. And so, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. So I have to go back and double check it. I think this is the first time in this plague, this part of Exodus, that the word sin is introduced to us. And that's significant. Before we read it today, okay. I think that's the actual word sin. I'm pretty sure it's the first time it's used. All right. Anything else from chapter 8? Plague 8. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Moses prayed here too.
Sure. And I don't. That'd be something we'd have to go and check to see if this is the first time prayer is involved. Now we do know that he's talking to God, and so that could be just synonyms, or it could be something more significant. The Hebrew word that is used to describe the fire and the hail is that it's self-perpetuating. It's a self-perpetuating fire. When's the last time we've had self-perpetuating fire? What's that? Well, no, in Exodus. I'm sorry, inside of Exodus. Burning bush, which is a forest fire. So you were right there on it, you know. So, yeah. Well, you know, it's probably origin here. So I mean, that's interesting to me. But what we have is not just hail and a thunderstorm. What the wording describes a self-perpetuating storm. That's the only two times that they're used. This self-perpetuating fire, that concept is burning bush and here. Well, I mean, you can make that conclusion. I think that's a fair conclusion. The text, again, doesn't tell us that God is in here like God was in chapter 3. But just in the wording that's used, that's worth some exploring. But the main, either way, it is not a normal hailstorm. That this is a hailstorm that is on its own measures growing and getting larger and stronger and stronger and stronger without outside force. That's the concept. Now, whether or not that's because God is present, we don't know. But the key of self-perpetuation is right. You know, which is, to me, I think it's comfortable to draw the two connection. One, because you have a great deal of introduction from God's disclosing of His own nature, His own heart for why. So, you know, it's not that God is not invested in all these other ones, but at least in this plague, from the wording, there is a level that God is speaking more about His investment in here. For what purpose? Well, the purpose is this reason. I'm letting everybody know why. All right? So there's this disclosure from God. And that's the first time that we have that, at least in the plagues. Okay? Now, we do get God's heart disclosing in chapter 3 and in chapter 5, where Moses has these visions, these interactions with God. But this is a little bit different. And so I think it's a safe bet to say that there's definitely some high investment from God in this plague, more so than at least the other ones that we've had. All right? I think we're past time, right? All right. So what we'll do is we'll pick up We'll pick up the next time we meet. We'll do the last 2 plagues. We'll do 8 and 9 fairly quick, and then we'll spend a lot of time on 10. All right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.